right, well, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks all for being here today. I'm Amanda Sternberg with the Homeless Action Network of Detroit, and today we are going to be talking about the process for applying for renewal funding in this year's 2023 CoC competition. So hopefully you are all in the right place, and thanks for being here this morning. So just some an overview of kind of what we're going to be talking about, do some quick kind of housekeeping items. We're going to do a quick recap of the 2022 competition. We'll then be talking a bit about the timeline for this year and what you can expect in the coming months. I'm going to go over a bit regarding the renewal project application scoring details and some information as it relates to the application itself and what you'll be needing to submit to hand. And then time for questions, of course. So just some housekeeping. Hopefully everyone knows by now, keep yourself on mute if you're not talking. As I go throughout the presentation, feel free to use the chat box, use the raise your hand feature. We can stop and take questions as we go along. If your question is something that I will be addressing later on, I may just defer until we get to that part of the presentation, but don't be afraid to pop questions out as we go along. Today's recording and the slides, everything will be available within the next few days. We'll be posting it to HAND's website so you can access that material there. Attendance at this webinar is not required for the application process. It's of course strongly encouraged, but if someone, I guess I would say if someone from your agency wasn't here live, it's not a requirement to be here live during the webinar in order to still apply, although again, strongly encouraged. So today's materials will be posted again, like I said, on HAND's website. That link is there. I will also be putting that link in the chat box. You have probably received this link already. All of the materials for the application process, all of the forms that I'm going to be going over today, this recording and the slides, everything will be posted there. So you really want to bookmark that page because you'll probably be wanting to go back to it frequently in the coming months. So just keep that page handy. Okay, we're going to dive in and do a quick recap of the 2022 competition. So last year's competition, just to kind of set the stage and let folks know sort of the end result of what happened last year. So for the 2022 competition, for the projects that we submitted to HUD last September, HUD made those funding announcements earlier this spring in March, on March 28th. So those funding announcements were made. The Detroit CoC was awarded a total of just over $32 million in funding from the 2022 competition. That included both renewal and new project funding. And it was a 4.7% increase from the prior year. So we were excited to see that bit of an increase in funding. This table, I know there's kind of a lot of numbers on there, maybe a little bit harder to discern, but I just wanted to give sort of a snapshot of what was funded in the 2022 competition. Again, as these slides are available, you'll be able to review this in more detail if you like. But really what I wanted to point out on this chart is that the majority of the funding that we received in last year's competition is for renewal projects, about 28 million, almost 30 million of that 32 million that we received is in our renewal projects, which is kind of all of you right here, agencies that are currently receiving CoC funding and are applying for additional funding are those renewal projects. And even within the renewal projects, as you can see, the majority of it is also permanent supportive housing. So over the past really number of years, probably 8 years or so, the continuum of care has really made a priority to fund permanent supportive housing projects. And so we see that when we look at these renewal projects, and we see that a good proportion of our renewal funding is for permanent supportive housing projects. And so you can, again, kind of see the breakdown here of renewals that were funded and new, and then the total. I do include here on this chart the CoC planning grant. CoC planning is a funding that is available only to the collaborative applicant. That is a role that HAND has been designated to play by the CoC body. Our role as the collaborative applicant means that we oversee and administer this entire application process, in addition to a number of other things. So CoC planning funds is a source of funding that HUD makes available to the collaborative applicant. Is considered new funding every year, and it is a source of funding that can only be used for CoC planning. So it's not funding that could be used for housing or services or programming dollars. It's dedicated just to the role that the collaborative applicant plays. So you see that as a new funding on this chart because it is considered a new grant every year. So we do include it in our overall amount of funding that we receive. So in last year's competition, all of our renewal projects were renewed for their full amount, which we were excited about. That was really good news for all of you who currently receive funding. You were renewed for another year at the full amount that you had applied for. We did also have 2 new projects that were funded in the 2022 competition. One new project was funded with what's called CoC bonus dollars. So that is one pool of new funding that's available. We had a new PSH project that was funded. The grantee is Wayne Metro Community Action Agency. And this new project will bring 45 units of additional permanent supportive housing to our community. That project will start ramping up later this fall. It's an expansion of one of their existing PSH projects. We also had a new domestic violence bonus project funded. This project was funded for about $636,000. The grantee is Neighborhood Legal Services. This is for a what's called a joint component project, which is a joint component project combines transitional housing and rapid rehousing into one project type. So this is really an expansion of their existing domestic violence THRRH project. That project unfortunately had lost some funding in the 2021 competition. So this new funding will help to restore some of that funding that was lost. So we're excited about the ability to kind of get this project back up to its full capacity. And again, that new funding will be available for the agency a little bit later this year. And so they'll be able to kind of bring those additional units and beds back online. We did have a number of 4 additional new projects that we had submitted to HUD last fall that unfortunately HUD did not fund. You can see these on this chart here. There were 3 additional CoC bonus projects, two other PSH and a new HMIS project, and then another new domestic violence bonus project, which was also not selected by HUD for funding. All of these new projects had been placed into Tier 2 in our project priority ranking. And so that's largely why they were not selected. Projects that are placed in Tier 2 are at greater risk of not being selected by HUD for funding, and the extent to which we get those Tier 2 projects funded really depends on our overall CoC application score. So unfortunately, due to us not scoring high enough and some other factors such as the total amount of funding that HUD had available, we were not able to get these new projects funded. Last year, the CoC board had made a decision to prioritize for funding our renewal projects. And so because of that, the new projects were placed in Tier 2, which the outcome of that is, as I mentioned before, all of our renewal projects were funded, but we were not able to get all of our new projects funded. So every year, this is part of those prioritization discussions that happen in terms of how we're going to prioritize and rank our projects. Those discussions are still underway for this year. The CoC board will be making some policy decisions on project ranking and project prioritization a little bit later this summer. So those discussions are happening within the Values and Funding Priority Committee. So kind of more to come on that once those policies go before the CoC board. I referenced earlier the score on the CoC application. So the application that we submit to HUD is reviewed by HUD and scored. HUD then provides us some information on that score, which they provided that to us earlier this spring in April. So hand staff have been taking some time to go through, analyze that score, identify how we performed well, maybe some weaknesses or areas for improvement, opportunities for improvement. So we intend to bring that analysis to the CoC board in the coming months. I will say overall, we did, I would say, score pretty well. Again, there's always room for improvements, but I think we were overall quite pleased in how we scored. So, the intent of this, again, the way that HUD uses this score on the CoC application is to help determine, again, those tier 2 projects are funded. That's a big factor that comes into play. So the higher we can score on our CoC application, the greater likelihood we may have of getting those tier 2 projects funded. The CoC application score is also really what comes into play when we talk about this being a CoC competition. These dollars that we're applying for, these continuum of care dollars, are distributed competitively across the country. So in essence, we are competing against other CoCs across the country. So this score that we received is compared to the scores of other CoCs as well. And so that's kind of one of those factors that HUD uses when making their funding decisions. So, some of your agencies may be used to receiving other sources of funding, perhaps that are, through the city of Detroit or the state or whatever, that are maybe funds that are, allocated to that jurisdiction based on a formula, it's sort of as an entitlement allocation. That is not the case with continuum of care dollars. Continuum of care dollars are applied for competitively on an annual basis. So there's sort of a different angle to how our community is able to get these dollars, because again, it's based on local performance, our obviously completion of the application to HUD. So while every year we certainly continue to strive to perform our best, again, keep in mind they are competitive dollars. So last thing, as it relates to the 2022 competition, as I mentioned, HUD made those funding announcements in March. So at this point, you should be hearing directly from your local HUD rep on getting those grant agreements in place. My understanding is that the local field office may prioritize grant agreements for projects that had, expiration dates earlier in the calendar year, and they may wait, get those out first, because those are the projects that really need those grant agreements in place. But at this point, your grant agreement, that information will come directly from the local HUD field office. So just please be mindful of that. Obviously, respond accordingly to get all of that information submitted as needed. Your 2022 grant agreements that are coming out, those are for your project terms that will have a start date at some point this calendar year in 2023. For some of you, that may have already started. We have a couple of projects that have start dates that are kind of within the first quarter of the year. For some of you, those start dates may be, later this summer or this fall. But your 2022 grant agreements are for your project term that goes from 2023 to 2024. The renewal projects that we're talking about now that you're going to be submitting for will have start dates that will start in 2024 and go through 2025. We have a few projects that have a January 1st start date and a December 31st end date. So the start and end dates are in the same calendar year. That's not the norm, but I know that does apply to some of you. So if you have any questions about the dates or the project terms, I know sometimes it can take a little bit to kind of get used to how those dates all work. Feel free to put a question in the chat or reach out. Okay, I'm going to talk a bit about the timeline. I realize this text might be a little bit small. This timeline information is also in the materials that were sent out earlier and that are all posted to our website as well. But just want to kind of quickly run through the timeline and what you can expect in the coming months. Some of these precise dates we don't have determined yet. Those more precise dates will be communicated, as they're determined through our email listserv and through being posted on our website as well. The first date to keep in mind is June 12th at noon, so a little under a month. Your renewal project applications are due to hand. So June 12th, the 12th at 12 p.m. June 12th at noon is when those materials are due. And as we go on, I'll be talking in more details about what it is that you are going to have to submit to hand. I want to touch briefly on as well on this timeline as it relates to new project applications. We're not going to be talking in any depth today about new projects because we'll be talking about that more in a future webinar, but just in case your agency might be considering applying for new project funding, just kind of thinking through what you, timeline-wise, what you may be looking at. So we anticipate releasing our new project RFP and applications for new project funding in mid-June, with then those applications being due late July. So June through July. A lot of this too is dependent on when the HUD releases their notice of funding opportunity. So all timelines are subject to change. Over the course of June to August, then after you submit your renewal application materials to us, that's then we go through and we review your applications, do the application scoring, provide you with your scores. If there's an appeals process that you need to go through, that will all happen over the course of June to August. We anticipate starting in August into September is when you will be instructed to start entering your project applications into eSnaps. eSnaps is the online application portal that's used to actually submit that application to HUD. I know many of you have worked in eSnaps a lot. You're very familiar with it. If you are newer to working in eSnaps, that's not a problem. I'm more than happy to help kind of give some guidance on that. But just kind of keep that time frame in mind. This is what we anticipate, kind of the August-September time frame. It could change. Again, it could need to start earlier. You will receive more information from me when you need to start that eSnaps entry. What I would encourage you right now to do is to make sure that the appropriate people at your agency have access to eSnaps, and that ideally more than one person at your agency has access to eSnaps. This is especially important if you've had staff, turnover over the past year. But what we don't want to have happen is that you're kind of waiting until the last minute to get access to eSnaps. So if you need help in how to get access to eSnaps, or if you're not sure who at your agency has that access, you can always reach out to me as well. I'm happy to provide some guidance there. So as we then round the corner into September, this is when we anticipate the CoC board will be making decisions on new project applications. After September, then once we know which new projects will be submitted to HUD, we will then develop the final project priority ranking list. Those policies will have been developed by then, with the intent that by early October, we'll know how the projects will be ranked when we submit them to HUD, with the plan and the intent that all of our project applications and the CoC application be submitted to HUD for renewal or for the new project. So we anticipate, again, kind of the competition from HUD's side really opening in July when they release the notice of funding opportunity, and then closing in October. Again, this is all subject to change once HUD actually releases the notice of funding opportunity. But just to kind of give you a sense of what you may expect over the coming summer. Again, key date to keep in mind is June 12th at noon. That's when your renewal project applications, so those projects that you are currently receiving funding for, are due to hand. And I had a comment as well, a note from one of our grantees that just wanted me to remind folks that grantees can okay, I think the comment is related to if you are, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you are a subrecipient for if you are a subrecipient through either it would be the state of Michigan or Detroit Wayne or perhaps another subrecipient, you're going to be working closely with that recipient, that direct grantee. They may require additional materials from you to be submitted to them so that they can review and put the whole package together to be submitted to hand. So if you have that recipient subrecipient relationship, just be on the lookout for probably additional communication from that direct grant recipient, and you'll need to respond accordingly to kind of whatever they ask you for. Ultimately, hand is expecting application materials to come from the recipient, i.e. the direct grantee. They are the entity who's responsible to getting materials into hand on time. So just kind of be mindful of that. And for the person who made that comment, if I misinterpreted what you're saying, please correct me.
Hi, Amanda, this is Tania. Yes, you mentioned that correctly. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for that reminder. Okay, I'm going to move into then some details regarding renewal projects for this year. So again, as I said before, this renewal process is for projects that are expiring in calendar year 2024 and for projects that are not being reallocated. So no decisions have been made regarding project reallocation. If that does ultimately apply to you, you will hear a totally separate communication about that. Just real quick, project reallocation is when funding is taken from a renewal project and is used to fund new projects. So the budget of a renewal project could be reduced partially. The CoC board can make a decision to not fund a renewal project at all, and then the funding from that renewal project would be used to fund new projects. So typically, we would look at reallocation if there's ongoing consistent concerns around project performance, if there's concerns that a project is no longer meeting a need in the community. That is typically what has driven reallocation in the past. So this is another kind of policy area that we haven't made final decisions yet on. We will be revisiting that policy with the CoC board in the coming months. Again, if this ultimately does apply to your project, you'll be getting a lot more kind of direct communication about that. I do want to make the note that renewal funding is not guaranteed. So at this point, we don't yet know the total amount of funding that HUD is going to make available to the Detroit CoC. Likewise, when we enter into those conversations around project prioritization, that's going to impact kind of where projects ultimately are prioritized for funding to HUD. So with all of that, we can't ever guarantee renewal funding from year to year. We have had, unfortunately, situations in the past where renewal projects were submitted to HUD, but they were not selected by HUD for funding. And so those projects then, they were not renewed. And we worked with them to kind of ramp down the project accordingly. So this is, again, one of those factors to kind of keep in mind in this with these projects that we can't guarantee renewal funding from year to year. So eligibility to apply for renewal funding. You need to submit your application materials as instructed. That would be both the materials that are going to be due to hand in June, and then when it comes time to enter those applications into eSNAPs, all of that will need to be submitted according to the timeline that you'll get from me. If you don't submit things, we can't move your project forward. Projects do need to score at least 70% on the local application scoring criteria. That is a scoring threshold that we have had within the CoC for a number of years. And our policies currently state that projects have to score at least 70% to be submitted for renewal funding. There is an appeals process available for projects that do not score 70%. They can submit an appeal to provide rationale for why their projects should continue to receive funding. That appeal is then reviewed by an appeals committee, and then they make recommendations to the CoC board. But just know that we do have that scoring threshold in place. So other things to be eligible, I mean, you need to be in compliance with, if you're on a corrective action plan, if there's any compliance issues there, that would be taken into consideration. Need to be in compliance with HUD's regulations. If there's I'll touch on this a little bit more too when we talk about our review of monitoring reports, but if at any point the CoC becomes aware of significant ongoing compliance issues on the regulatory side, that will be taken into consideration and could impact your eligibility to be renewed. I'm going to move a bit now and talking a little bit more specifically about this evaluation and scoring criteria that we're going to be using to evaluate your renewal projects. So the performance period that we're considering is calendar year 2022. So we always take a look back over the prior calendar year. For many of you, that's going to be different than your actual project term. Our renewal projects really all operate on different project terms. Some have July to June terms, some are October to September. So this is one of those strange things about CoC funding, is that projects just have different project terms. And so to create some consistency in how we evaluate projects, we look at the same time frame for all projects, and that's the prior calendar year. So we're looking at everything that occurred in 2022. As we developed the evaluation and scoring criteria, there were a number of things that were taken into consideration. We looked at what was used in last year's competition, that scoring criteria. We looked at, so when I say that we looked at last year's, looked at overall averages on how projects performed, looked at if there was anything that we wanted to change or tweak or improve from last year. We also took a look at some preliminary data for calendar year 2022 by running reports from HMIS to get a sense of how projects are kind of shaping up against some of these performance criteria. We considered known ways that COVID-19 may still have impacted certain areas of performance, based on what we've heard from providers in different work group settings or just different meetings throughout the year. We really try to be mindful of that. And lastly, a couple of years ago, we had a consultant through Housing Innovations do some work in analyzing how our CoC evaluates projects. And so based on some recommendations that they made there, we considered that and reviewed that as well when we developed our evaluation criteria. I have a link to that Housing Innovations report in some of our materials. If anyone wants that sent to them directly, let me know. I'm happy to share it. So the development of this evaluation criteria, then the draft renewal project evaluation criteria then went out for public comment in early April. So we certainly invited input, feedback on that criteria from providers. We received a couple of comments. Those comments were taken into consideration when we developed the final criteria, and that final evaluation criteria went to the CoC board at their May board meeting that they approved. The comments that we received and those responses to those comments are posted on our website as well, so you can see what came in on that side. All right, so at this point, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to drop in the chat this website that I keep referring to. This is HAND's website, where you can find all of the materials. I'm also going to switch over, and that was not what I want to do. Sorry. Going to go over the actual application, essentially kind of the application packet itself. So this document here, again, this is posted on our website. Hopefully you've had a chance to already pull it up and download it. But this is really contains all of the information I'm going over here plus more. So you really are going to want to keep this packet handy and refer back to it in the coming weeks. Hopefully everything that you need to know will be in here, but I'm just going to walk through some key parts of this document. As you can see, it's about 50 pages long, so I'm not going to go through it word by word. because I also know that you are able to read and review it on your own, but I really just want to kind of walk through what's here and highlight some really important things that you'll need to be mindful of. So first thing, of course, the due date, July 12th at noon. Please make note of that time. This is, I think, the first year that we've put a time frame deadline to this at noon. That's really helpful for us so that we have a little bit more time to pull all the materials together. So noon on June 12th. So 12/12, keep that in mind. Okay. So there's some materials here, some information here that's just kind of background context. Again, I recognize some folks on this call may be newer to this application process and what the kind of the CoC funding process is. So just try to give some background on kind of what this is all about. And again, a broad overview of the timeline for the coming months. As I mentioned earlier, we're still finalizing some dates as it relates to new project application processes. So when that RFP will be released, we'll be having a whole separate webinar for new project applications. That all is still in development. So you can keep an eye on your email for more information related to that. Renewal project eligibility, I've covered. I want to touch briefly here on audits and funder monitoring reports. You will see in the application materials, which I'll go over in a little bit more detail as well, some attachments that you're going to be required to submit. So one is your most recent, your organization's most recent financial audit. So this would be an audit that has been completed. If you have an audit that's kind of still in process, perhaps you only have a draft version of it from your auditor, or maybe your board hasn't had a chance to review it yet. That's not really what we're looking for. We're looking for your most recently completed audit. Because we know when you get to that draft audit, sometimes there's changes that are made. So we're really looking for the most recently final completed audit. For the agencies that are subject to the single audit or the A133 audit, we need a copy of that one as well. That requirement may not apply. It's going to depend on the amount of federal funding that you expend in any given year. So A133 doesn't apply to you. You'll see on the checklist, you're just going to say that doesn't apply. We are also asking for monitoring reports from HUD, from either HUD or the City of Detroit on the City of Detroit side for any homelessness program funding that you may receive, for monitoring reports and any responses to those reports that are dated from March of 2022 to March of 2023. So essentially the past year. That may or may not apply, particularly on the HUD monitoring side. We know that HUD will typically monitors projects every 3 years or so. So if you don't have anything from HUD in that time frame, you're just going to mark, that's not applicable. You may be more likely, if you receive funding from the city, to have a city monitoring report, again, from March of 2022 to March of 2023. And so we will want those materials as well. We will be reviewing your financial audits and your monitoring reports. There are negative points that may be assigned to your projects if there's outstanding unresolved findings. The application materials go into some more details of specifically what we look for, but essentially we take that into consideration as a way to consider overall agency financial performance, responsiveness to monitoring findings, and just really to make sure agencies are compliant and responsive to what their auditors and what their funders are requiring them to be responsive to. The other thing I want to note here, this paragraph here, is just some language that we've had in our materials over the past couple of years, that if there's something that comes up where the CoC becomes aware of other audit findings that may have occurred from either another funder, another federal entity like the Office of Inspector General, if HUD makes us additionally aware of anything else, we will take those factors into consideration as well. So we know that sometimes there's things that come up that may be outside of the materials that your agencies submit to us. And so, we just have this language here that to the extent that we are made aware of that, we will, take that into consideration as well. I touched briefly on the renewal project threshold scoring. Again, that 70% threshold is in place for projects that fall below that 70%. There's an appeals process that you can go through, submit, and to still be considered for funding. The project priority ranking policies, again, those are going to be developed in the Values and Funding Priority Committee in the coming weeks, with the plan that they will go to the CoC board for the board's approval at their July board meeting. So once those are approved, they will be posted to our website, and so you can review them there. So the next part of this document, we've really just wanted to highlight and provide kind of a summary to changes that were made to the scoring criteria this year versus last year. If this was just in case you're curious of, just want to know what's new or what's different, this table here just kind of provides that highlight. We certainly go into some more details here then on the renewal project scoring. So this section 8 is a summary chart. As you can see, it's broken down by project type, and it gives the evaluation component and the maximum point value for each of those evaluation components, for the different project types. This again is another summary chart. You'll see later on in the document, we go into even more details. The one thing I wanted to point out, a couple of things I want to point out in this chart, anything in red, text, again, that's meant to highlight an evaluation component that was changed from the prior year. So again, if you just want to focus on, I just want to know what's different, what's either new or different from the prior year, those are highlighted in red. You'll see these numbers in these percentages in parentheses. That is the value or the weight that overall component has in comparison to the total points possible. So the reason why we do that is to try to demonstrate, again, how different kind of main buckets of these scoring criteria are weighted. So you can get a sense of kind of where the emphasis or where the priority is being placed in this evaluation criteria. So, for example, and probably not surprisingly, evaluation components that relate to housing performance and quality, you can see are worth between 40% or so of the total number of points possible for a project. That's because we really are placing an emphasis and a priority on evaluation and performance factors related to housing. We want these programs to ultimately house people who are experiencing homelessness. So that's kind of what those percentages indicate. The other thing I want to note is at the bottom of this chart, you see the total points possible. And you can see, for that these total points possible do vary for the different project types. So permanent supportive housing have a total of 125 points possible. And then, our one the one coordinated entry grant that will be evaluated has 71 points possible. So the reason why there's different maximum number of points possible, it really has to do with the different criteria that projects are evaluated on. There's some things we look at for PSH that we don't look at for other project types. Some things are weighted differently or worth a different number of points. For example, for rapid rehousing programs, there may be more points for like income or employment because these are short-term programs. So there's some nuances and some differences there. There may also be some differences as it relates to some data requirements. So completion of housing move-in dates, that's an element that we will be evaluating permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing projects on, because that's a key data element that applies to those projects. It doesn't apply to transitional housing programs. So there's some nuances and some differences there, and some of the things that we look at for some projects that don't apply to other projects. And so that's why you see kind of a variation in the total number of points possible. That's also why when we talk about a scoring threshold, we frame it as a percentage of the total points possible, that 70%. rather than just a raw number, because the number of points that any project could earn does vary from project to project. And even within these scoring criteria, there may be instances where for an individual project, something may not apply. Sometimes we know that going into this. Sometimes as we get into this review process, we realize, oh, this individual particular component isn't going to apply to this project for whatever reason. And if that occurs, then that point value, that evaluation criteria is essentially kind of removed from that individual project. So let me give you an example. There's an evaluation criteria around coordinated entry compliance. Let me see if I can scroll up there. That applies to all project types. It's worth 2 points. What this looks at is we look at of the people who were entered into your project in 2022, we review and affirm that they came from CAM through our coordinated entry system as a requirement of coordinated entry. So there are some instances, particularly with our PSH projects, if they don't have turnover, they did not take any new clients in 2022 because their units were all full. Everyone remained in their units. They didn't have anyone move out, to take new referrals from CAM. So this evaluation criteria of new client entries in 2022 isn't going to apply to them because they didn't take anyone in 2022, which is fine for that project type. So in that instance, then for that project, that 2 points would essentially be removed from the total number of points that the project could earn, and it would just kind of be removed from their total kind of rubric. So that's an example of where some of those things may happen on kind of a case-by-case basis. If that occurs, when you get your scoring criteria, you will see that in your the kind of scorecard that you get, and we explain that. There are also some informational only questions that you will see in the project application. Some of these are questions that you've seen for a number of years. For those of you who've been around, we're still asking them. There may be, I don't think any of them are new, actually. The reason why we ask these informational only questions is a couple of reasons. One is to help us to get a better understanding of our projects. We also ask them so that to kind of set the stage so that in the future, they may become a scored criteria or a scored component in a future competition. And we actually do have that happening this year. There's a question that is a new scored criteria for our domestic violence only projects, question where they are going to be required to answer about how their program helps to improve client safety. That has been an informational only question for the past couple of years. And so the decision was made to make that a scored question in this year's competition. So that's an example of how we have taken informational only questions and turned them into scored criteria at some point. This section here, I want to point out the deduction of points for late, incomplete, or incorrect submissions. It's really important that you get your materials in on time, again, by June 12th at noon. You may submit them before that. You can just, certainly no problem with submitting materials early. If you do submit materials early, just note that we're not going to be able to review them, tell you what's missing, and give you a chance to correct if anything is missing before the deadline. We just don't have the capacity for that. So please be sure when you submit your materials that they are submitted on time and complete. That's why we have a checklist, which I'll be going over in a moment. Anything that is not submitted on time, that's submitted late, there will be points deducted from your application score. And the number of points depends on kind of what is not submitted. If it's an item that we can, that HAND can access publicly, like an A133 report, those are all posted to the Federal Clearinghouse, or, perhaps an HMIS report, you'll get 1 point deducted because we can ultimately get that through other means, but there's still a penalty for not submitting it to us. If the item that's not submitted is something that can only come from your agency, then there's going to be a 3 point deduction for those items. So the reason why we do these point deductions is just to really emphasize the importance of getting everything in on time. We have a very sort of tight and regimented timeline on when we need to have these projects reviewed and materials reviewed. And so we really aren't able to accommodate, things being turned in late. It's got to be in on time. And so this is hopefully an incentive to get all of those items in on time. Note that I do want to make, you'll see here a note about outstanding assessment invoices. Again, for those of you that have received CoC funding for a while, you know that there is an assessment fee that is levied based on the percentage of funds, CoC funding that you receive. Those invoices, I'm honestly not sure if they've gone out or kind of where that process is at. You have a question about whether your invoice has been paid or not, you can contact me. That is funding that is, again, that's paid to hand, and is to help, again, support our role as the CoC lead and as the collaborative applicant. So if you have any questions about status of assessment invoices, let me know. I can connect you with a person at hand that can give you more information on that. The following pages 8 through, I'm not sure what number of pages, goes into more detail on the individual scored component. So again, this is a pretty detailed level of information. I'm not going to, again, take the time to go through it in line by line, because I know that you can review this on your own, but just kind of broadly what we have here. So these components are broken down kind of in topic areas. So component 1, mainstream resources and employment. We go through the different measures that are being looked at, the scoring scales. You'll note that sometimes there's differences in scoring scales for different project types. So as you're reviewing that, just please be sure that you're looking at the scale that applies to the project that you're considering, because there are some differences in the scoring scale and in the points available. So measures as it relates to income and employment, we're looking at things related to people who leave the program with cash income, which could be either earned income or benefits. We're going to be looking at people who leave a program with non-cash benefits. So that would include, food stamps, any other TANF benefits, health insurance. We're looking at people who leave the program with earned income and employment. And this one is specifically people who will exit the program with employment. So just a note on this, you'll note that for permanent supportive housing in particular, the scoring scale is relatively low, because we know there's challenges with, particularly people who may have been residing in permanent supportive housing with accessing employment. So, but there is still a sort of an expectation there that if people are leaving the program, that your agency has been working with them to help them gain employment. This employment is one, it ties to our overall system performance measures, which is a measure that HUD evaluates our entire CoC's performance on, which one of those performance factors that drives our ability to get more funding. So this is why we also kind of apply that measure to local projects as well. Also, within the line of income and employment, we look at people who increase their cash income while they're either in the program or when they exit the program. So this is looking not just, do they have some type of income while they're in the program, but do they actually increase their income? So a note that I want to make on this is that we've been, a lot of conversation has been had about this as well in the HMIS agency admin meetings for your clients who may receive Social Security benefits. If they get that annual increase in their benefits every year, and if that is recorded in HMIS, that's going to come through as an increase in income. So making sure that you're properly recording any changes or increase in benefits that your clients receive is helpful for both your project. When we look at this data, we're not looking at how much they've increased, just if there's been an increase. But again, this is one of those system performance measures as well that HUD evaluates us on as an entire system. So we really want to make sure that we're properly capturing that information. For permanent supportive housing projects only, we also do look at the people who remain in your program as of the end of the calendar year last year who were able to get health insurance. This was a newer measure we implemented a couple of years ago. Typically our PSH projects perform very well on this, but that's one that applies just to PSH projects. Excuse me. Component 2, this again is the one where it's really worth the majority of the, or I should say, it is the majority, the most of the points available. This all has to do with housing performance and housing quality. Most of these should look pretty familiar. They're roughly, the same as what we looked at in the past. For permanent supportive housing projects, we look at the percentage of people who either remained in permanent supportive housing as of the end of 2022 or had exited PSH to another permanent housing destination. Obviously, we know, PSH is a long-term program, so there's no expectation that clients will have exited over the course of the past year. Their retention of that PSH is just as important as moving to other PSH. That's why we look at both people who've stayed and people who have exited. For all project types, we do exclude certain clients from these calculations. So people who their exit destination was to one of these locations, if they passed away while in the program, if they exited the program to foster care, to a hospital, residential, a non-psychiatric facility, or a nursing home, those records are essentially removed from the calculations. We do this for a couple of reasons. One, we do it because it's consistent with how HUD calculates our performance on the system performance measure and what they look at. We also recognize that for these exit destinations, particularly, a client exiting to what is essentially a higher level of care, there's a lot of nuances that go into that, a lot of reasons for why that, may be the best thing for that individual just to better meet their needs. And so given just the nuances that are related to that, it just makes sense to kind of remove those clients from those calculations. So it neither hurts nor hinders the overall project score. We also take into consideration people that have been entered into your program in 2022 and exited, but never had a housing move-in date. This is kind of a greater level of nuance, but we recognize that there are times where you may receive a referral from CAM and you enter that individual into your program. So in HMIS, they have a project start date. For whatever reason, then perhaps you're not able to make contact with the client. Perhaps they decline working with your agency, which they're able to do. You end up having to exit them from the project, but you've never moved them into housing. This typically happens within a relatively short period of time. So we know that those are situations that occur. And so as we've done in years past, those clients likewise are excluded from the calculations, again, because we know there's nuanced situations on why that may occur. So to be consistent with prior years, those individuals likewise are excluded from the calculations. Also, on the housing side, we look at utilization rates, your overall utilization rates. We look at 5 dates over the past year, do an average of that, and then come up with the overall average utilization. I should have said to kind of at the start, and I'll reference these materials later on, we have what we call self-scoring tools, which are tools that go into a greater level of detail of how we actually do these calculations. So if you're wondering kind of how is the math done to come up with these percentages, we have some tools that walk you through that as well if you are really interested in formulas and calculations. So going back to this, another measure that we look at is the length of time from referral to housing move-in date. This applies to our permanent supportive housing and our rapid rehousing projects. You'll know that this length of time data, we provide it to our PSH and our rapid rehousing work groups over the course of the year. And it looks at how long it takes from when you receive a referral from CAM to when that person is moved into housing. So there's details in the application materials itself in Appendix B that actually tells you what your project performance was over the past year. So you don't have to guess, we kind of tell you up front. The way that we evaluate and score this criteria, it's going to vary depending on your particular project type, particularly for permanent supportive housing projects. We have it broken down into kind of 3 different types of projects. If you're a project-based, not SRO project, these are typically our tax credit projects. If you are an SRO or single room occupancy project, and then lastly, if you're a scattered site project. So we take kind of the overall average of each of those project types, and then your individual project's performance is going to be compared to the average of that project type. We do this because, as you can see, even with just this data here, comparing project-based PSH to SROs, there's a vast difference in the average length of time that it takes to move someone into those units. Number of reasons for that. Typically for our SRO projects, the agency themselves has a lot more kind of direct control. They can typically move someone into that unit very expediently as soon as that person is ready to move in, versus some of our project-based projects, that receive those tax credits. There's a lot more process that goes on with paperwork that needs to be gathered, background checks, the back and forth with the housing agents. And so we know that there's a lengthier time that, just due to the nature of the projects that it takes. And so that's why we really try to be a little bit more fair in comparing kind of apples to apples for those different project types. Part D here, I want to touch on briefly. This is a returns, looking at returns to homelessness. This is a scored criteria that we implemented newly last year's competition. So it's been returned. It's to look at again. So this is a slightly more complex measure. This is probably a harder one for our agency to do kind of a self-score on, because you need to be able to look at data kind of from the systems perspective. But essentially what we look at is, for clients who've exited the project from, this one we go back a little bit to 2021, the last quarter of 2021 through at any point in 2022, who exited to a permanent housing destination and then subsequently returned to homelessness within 6 months. That's the measure and the percentage that we're looking at. So a lower percentage in this case is certainly better. This is likewise one of our system performance measures. So this is why we've incorporated this at the project level as well, with really the intent to prevent people from obviously returning back to homelessness, and so help make sure that if they are exiting your project to a permanent housing destination, that work has been done to help make sure that that is a stable housing placement. And the reason why we only look at the 6 months for the return is because we recognize that kind of there's going to be a certain period of time where things may occur in an individual's life that may cause them to return to homelessness that is outside of the control or really the purview of your program. And so even though at the systems level, HUD looks at returns at the 12-month mark and the 2-month mark, once you get out to those longer timeframes, that becomes much more of a function of the entire homeless response system and less kind of the individual project. So that's why for our local evaluation process, we're looking just at that 6-month mark. The last kind of 2 items here, these are just for permanent supportive housing projects. These are evaluation criteria that we've had in place for the past couple of years in terms of the availability of services and how referrals are facilitated and tracked. So the section that I just went over really was just for, in the materials you see it referenced permanent supportive housing. Really the measures are the same for rapid rehousing, our joint component project types, and the transitional housing project types too. So won't go into a lot of detail. You will just note for this length of time from referral to housing move-in for rapid rehousing, we just give this particular scoring scale just for rapid rehousing projects as well. I'm going to pause because I see a couple of questions in the chat. So Jane, I see your request for the contact information regarding the assessment status info. I will provide that to you and to anyone else that needs it. The question as well is, how would utilization be calculated for a project that opened and leased up last year if it was not in operation at the beginning of the calendar year? Yep. So Luke, that is a good question. And so I am going to put a hold on that question. We have kind of a section that I'll be getting to as it relates to projects that have less than 12 months of operation in calendar year 2022. So I will get to that in a second. If I don't answer it at the end of this, circle back to it, but I think I'll answer that. All right, component 3 is all about kind of your financial performance. This is one of the criteria where we're not looking at on a calendar year. So this first piece, we look at the extent to which your agency has fully expended your most recent CoC grant. There's an appendix A in the application materials, again, tells you which grant we're looking at and how much of your grant you have fully expended. This information I pulled down through Sage. You know, the Sage is a reporting system where you report your APR and your final expenditures. So I pulled that information from Sage and it's all there. You can see in Appendix A how much of your grant you fully expended. So you can compare that with the scoring scales to determine the points that you'll receive. You'll see there are, this year we do have still kind of 2 different scoring scales depending if you have a rental assistance budget line or not. We've done that historically because rental assistance projects have historically had some more limitations on their ability to move funds around within their budget to fully expend their grant. And so that's why you'll see 2 different scales there. The next part of this section, I alluded to this a little bit earlier when talking about the monitoring reports and the audit reports that we will be receiving and reviewing. So if there are outstanding findings, there can be a total of up to 10 points deducted from a project score for any outstanding or unresolved findings. I will say we have never had to deduct a full 10 points. So I don't anticipate having to do that this year, but really what we wanted to do is to bring a greater level of clarification on what would result in a negative points for your project score based on an outstanding or unresolved audit finding. So we really tried to delineate that a little bit more clearly, just to be transparent. If you have, 2 points deducted because of an outstanding finding, we're able to clearly correlate that to kind of what that finding was, what we saw. So again, this goes into detail on what would result in points being deducted based on monitoring reports or audit reports. This next section that I'm moving to has to do with HMIS compliance. So as you know, HMIS is very important to us. It's very important to our entire CoC as a system. Hopefully you see the value of it as well in your agency. So there's a number of evaluation and score criteria for HMIS compliance. There are a couple of new elements that we are including this year. And so I will kind of get to those. First one, attendance at the agency admin meetings. Attendance at these meetings is really important so that you as an agency know what's happening in the HMIS world and that you can communicate that accordingly. There's a number of HMIS items, components 4B, 4C, and 4D, for which we are going to be looking at all the projects that you report into HMIS. So this is a situation where we're looking at more than just your individual CoC grant that's being renewed, but we're also from this data quality, this data completeness factors, we're looking at, city funded programs or perhaps ESP funded programs. There's an appendix in the application materials, Appendix C, that will tell you specifically for your agency which projects we're looking at. And we do this again to be transparent, so like when we pull these reports, which projects we're including. The reason why we include more than just your CoC funded project really is a way to hold agencies accountable to these really critical data elements that impact not just your program, but our entire system. The way that our HMIS is structured, with the sharing that we have, with the way that coordinated entry works through HMIS, it is really important that we have these data elements that are accurate and complete. And that depends on not just your CoC funded project, but other projects as well. So that's why for some of these criteria, we're holding you accountable for, again, projects that are funded through other funders. We do exclude street outreach programs. We exclude warming centers from these criteria because we know, just due to the nature of those programs, it can be really hard to get some of these data elements. So we do exclude those. Again, you can refer to Appendix C to see specifically which projects from your agency will be included. So this Part D, then we're looking at, again, this data quality and completeness for these kind of 10 elements here. This is information that gather my words here, for these reports that are dependent upon all of the, again, all of those projects in Appendix C, our HMIS system administrators will be running these reports. We're going to be running them at, the administrator level to make sure that the data comes through accurately. So there's nothing here that you have to submit. We're going to be running and generating those reports ourselves. But just know that these are the data quality and completeness factors that we're going to be looking at. These are pretty basic data elements that are expected to be collected and entered for everyone. Likewise, the accurate recording of the annual assessment. This again is a key factor. This also ties into kind of some of our system performance measures and having that annual assessment done when it needs to be done. So this is likewise scored criteria that we've had. And Part D looks at known exit destinations. This is, again, for all of the projects that are reported in HMIS. Want to clarify that for this element, we are not looking at permanent housing destinations. We're just looking at known destinations. So even if you exited people to a shelter or exited them to a homeless situation, what we're looking for is that the destination was known. That, again, it's an important factor for data quality, and just so we know kind of where people are going when they exit your programs. When we see those destinations unknown, it really hard for us to know what's happening with clients as they exit your program. So this is looking at known destinations. And I will say it's been really encouraging to see agencies score very well on these components in the past. You all are really responding to our request to keep up on your data, and we are seeing that come through when we run these reports and when we do this evaluation. So kudos to everyone. Component 4E, housing inventory chart submission. Those had to be submitted in on time, and that was communicated earlier this year. So we are hopeful that those all got in on time. I think I said earlier I wasn't going to go through these one by one, but apparently I am. Thank you for putting up with me. These next two I really want to pause on because these are newer HMIS scored criteria, Part F and Part G. So Part F is only going to apply to CoC funded PSH and rapid rehousing programs. So it's not going to apply to everyone. We've given you all a heads up over the past year that this would be a scored component this year. So hopefully you have been kind of responsive and mindful of that over the past year. So you be familiar with the fact that over the course of the year, there are quarterly point in time count and housing move-in date audits that are done. You get information from our HMIS system administrator on kind of when these audits are happening. You're given certain instructions, things to submit by to really affirm over the kind of course of that quarter who is in your program, housing move-in dates are entered, that all of the data is accurate. We do this on a quarterly basis, again, to help kind of keep up on our data to make sure that as we go along throughout the year, the data that's entered is complete and accurate. It's an accurate reflection of who's in your program at any given time, who has been moved into housing, all of that. What we have found in the past is that at times, once an agency affirms that the data for any given quarter is final and complete and an accurate representation of their program, that subsequently at a later date, that data will have been changed. So, looking back and say, the data you affirmed in March has now been changed. That's problematic. It's problematic because it kind of throws off our data. It's problematic because it also calls into question why certain data would have been affirmed as being an accurate representation of who was in your program, when then months later it's changed. So because of that, we started this, we're implementing this as a scored criteria, and that points can be earned if we can see that once data was affirmed as being complete and accurate, that no subsequent changes have been made to it. So I give details here on how this is going to be evaluated. This is an element where our system administrator will be running some reports and doing a comparison. So this is one of those things that gets to kind of the self-scoring that's going to be a little bit more difficult, because essentially our sysadmin is going to be comparing what your agency affirmed and submitted at some point last year with what the data looks like now, and then going to be assigning points accordingly. A couple of caveats. There are some things that will be taken into consideration. So client transfers. So we know there may have been instances over the course of the year where your agency received a client transfer, and that based on when that transfer occurred, that may have resulted in a change in the point in time data. A lot of nuances on why transfers occur, when they occur, how that data is entered, how it impacts your data. So for receiving agencies of client transfers, if there was a change in your data because of you received a transfer, you will not be held accountable for that. That will not be a factor that would impact the score. However, if you are an agency that is sending a client transfer, and we can tell that the data was changed because you had to go back and essentially exit a client who should have been exited probably some months ago, that your agency will be held accountable for that. We are again incorporating this because some of this really gets to overall program management, not just the data entry piece of it, but the overall management of the program and knowing who's in your program, who needs to be exited. Does a transfer need to be pursued? This is one way where we see some things that perhaps could be shored up and tightened up a bit within the programs. And so this is one way that we're trying to hold agencies accountable to that. So this is a sort of a two-part scored criteria. The first one, which is worth 3 points, is going to look at just at your CoC funded permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing project. So it may not apply to everyone. Then there's a second kind of piece of it, part G, which is worth 2 points, which would apply only if you had a non-CoC funded or a non-rapid rehousing, non-CoC funded rapid rehousing project. So again, part G may not apply to anyone if you don't have any PSH, non-PSH or non-CoC rapid rehousing programs. Just pause there for a minute to see if there's any questions on that one. Okay. All right, I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit here. So the next section, we move into looking at persons with lived experience. These questions are the same as they have been in the past. One thing I do want to point out is that we do ask for documentation of a person with lived experience, a person who's homeless or formerly homeless, documentation that they either on your board, an equivalent decision-making entity, or if you have an agency policy to not disclose that person's identity, that you simply submit a letter with your application indicating such. One thing I want to point out that we are really kind of clarifying this year that came into kind of situations in the past, if you submit a board roster that has, your board members' names, perhaps their affiliation, and if one of those individuals is the person with lived experience on your board, it needs to be clearly indicated in that document who that person is. What's happened in the past is I've received a board roster. I can see everyone's name, perhaps an agency or a company that they're affiliated with, but there's no way for me to indicate who of all of these individuals is the person with lived experience. So if you're submitting that board roster, and if you are able to disclose kind of who that person is, you need to either like highlight their name, circle their name, somehow have it indicated in that document. So when I see the list of names, I can see if this individual is the person with lived experience. Again, if you are not comfortable actually disclosing that individual's name, then you need to submit a letter from your agency simply saying, yes, we're in compliant, but we just choose not to disclose this individual's identity. We accept that as well. So just kind of please be mindful of that when you're pulling together your materials. The last thing I want to say about kind of this section here has to do with substantiated grievances. This is a scoring criteria that we have had consistent over the past couple of years, where points will be deducted if there have been substantiated grievances filed against your agency or your program over the course of 2022. Appendix D goes into some more details on how those negative points would apply. Excuse me. I will say that if you should have received notification from the grievance committee kind of over the course of this past year as grievances were filed and substantiated, if this does apply, and if you will end up having points deducted from your score because of that. The next section, component 6, has to do with participation within coordinated entry. A lot of this, again, is really data related. We're going to be looking at ensuring that you've completed certain data elements within HMIS as it relates to receiving referrals from coordinated entry. I will say overall, our agencies tend to score quite well on this piece. I think, you understand what's required as it relates to entering certain data elements, as it relates to referrals from CAM. Again, there's details there that you can read over to understand what we're looking at there. It's really nothing new in that section. I want to, sorry, I'm flipping back and forth here. The next section, component 7, applies just to our coordinated entry SSO grants. In years past, this section has been a bit larger, and we've had different evaluation criteria for the 2 different direct recipients that we have of our coordinated entry grant. So right now, Community and Home Support, CHS, sorry, receives a coordinated entry grant to support their navigation work. Southwest Counseling Solutions receives a coordinated entry grant to support their role as the CAM lead agency. In prior competitions, we would have had some varying evaluation criteria for those 2 different agencies, depending on some of the specifics of the work that they carried out with those funds. So this year, if you look at this, you're going to see only CHS identified. As you may know, we are going through a transition process with coordinated entry. And so by the time these renewal applications are submitted, we will be in the process of transferring the Southwest Counseling Solutions coordinated entry grant to the new CAM lead agency. That decision-making process is underway. So because of this, and because we're sort of in this transition, Southwest is not going to be the entity submitting that coordinated entry grant for renewal funding. That renewal submission will happen with the new lead agency. Again, all of those details and processes to be worked out in the coming months. But because of that, given all of that transition that's happening, the prior evaluation criteria that we would have looked at for Southwest, it doesn't really make sense to look at for whoever the new lead agency is going to be, because they will not have implemented that programming by June 12th. So for that reason, excuse me, for this component, we're only looking at CHS. They have obviously been implementing their navigation work over the past year. They will continue to hold that coordinated entry, navigation grant into the future. And so we've really pared down these evaluation criteria to just focus on that role that CHS plays. So just wanted to point that out. If you were comparing like this year's materials to last year's, you might see that why this component looks differently. So just wanted to point that out. The last, maybe second to the last, last one that I want to point out here, this is a new component. So this component number 8 is going to apply only to projects that are specifically receive funding to serve people fleeing domestic violence. So right now we have 2 projects that this applies to. They were funded under the DV bonus funding at some point. This is a narrative response that those agencies are going to have to complete. That just describes how their program helped to improve the safety of the people that they serve. This was, again, something that's been an informational only question for the past couple of years. We are including it as a scored criteria this year just to really emphasize the importance that these DV projects have, and not only helping to keep people housed, but also to help improve their safety as well. So for our DV funded agencies, you'll just want to be sure to take note of that. Okay, I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit here. So this is section on page 21 here. I think we'll get to Luke's earlier question about how do we handle certain situations if projects are kind of what we term a first or second time renewal project. Due to some of the strangeness of how these funding cycles work, there can be times where a project has to submit for renewal funding even before they've even started implementing any programming, or when they've only had kind of a few months of operations kind of under their belts. So we really look at this first or second time renewals are typically projects that have less than 12 full months of operation in calendar year 2022. So typically, perhaps if projects started ramping up, say, July of 2022 or August or October of 2022, they'll only have a few months of operation in that calendar year. And because we're looking at a calendar year, how does that impact the data that we look at? So we really wanted to try to clarify that in this chart. And there's some differences if the renewal project was initially funded as what's called like a standalone renewal, meaning when that project was initially funded, it was not an expansion grant. An expansion grant is a new project that's funded that is essentially expanding an existing program. It was an existing CoC funded project that applied for new funding, was awarded new funding, and then when it comes up for renewal, it's being renewed as one project. So that's an expansion. So there's some differences in terms of how these projects are evaluated based on whether or not it's a standalone renewal or an expansion renewal. For the most part, a standalone renewal project, and not to call out Luke or Ruth Ellis, but I will. So the Ruth Ellis project is an example of a standalone renewal. It was initially funded as a brand new project. It was not an expansion of an existing grant. So it is now coming up. I think this is actually the second year that project is being renewed. Got operations underway at some point in 2022. So again, not a full calendar year. So for the most part, the majority of these scored components are not going to apply to a standalone renewal. When it comes to our kind of project ranking priorities, we take into consideration where those first or second time renewals fall, given that we really have very little data to evaluate them on because they've not been doing much, because the projects haven't started. I don't mean that you haven't been doing much. You've been doing a lot of work. That came out, that came across poorly. But in terms of looking at the evaluation criteria that we've laid out over the course of that calendar year, we don't want to penalize a project for not having a lot of performance data because they just got underway. So for the most part, for these standalone renewals, you're going to see all of these components are not scored. There are some things that may come into consideration, such as HMIS related components. Because again, for some of those, we're looking at all of the projects that an agency reports into HMIS. So if an agency has other funded projects that are in HMIS, we are going to score those, and those points will apply. But for project specific components like all those housing outcomes, which is like the utilization rates or housing outcomes, employment or income outcomes, those points aren't going to apply for those standalone projects. For expansion projects, because the projects are being submitted for renewal as one project, we're looking at the existing project's performance because that project has already been underway for, in many cases, a number of years. So it's that kind of existing projects data that we're going to be looking at. So again, we really try to go into detail for each of the project components here on kind of what applies, what doesn't apply, depending on if you're, again, a standalone renewal or if you're part of an expansion, if your renewal is part of an expansion. Once you've had a chance to look at this, if you're still not clear, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to clarify as well. I'm going to kind of keep going. Again, you can certainly read through this in more detail. What I wanted to point out here with section C, this is going to be particularly relevant, again, if you have that recipient-subrecipient relationship, kind of what applies to who and what are we looking at from who. So again, really tried to break it down by the individual scored component in terms of what's going to relate to the recipient versus the subrecipient. Again, I'll kind of put that plug that if you have that recipient-subrecipient relationship, you're likely going to hear from the recipient, probably, again, maybe from MDHHS or Detroit Wayne. They're probably going to ask you that you submit certain materials to them ahead of that June 12th deadline, probably quite a bit ahead of that June 12th deadline, so they can gather those materials, package it up, and get it to me by the deadline. So as a subrecipient, you are responsible for responding to what your recipients ask you to send that to them. Do not, if you are a subrecipient, do not send application materials directly to me. They need to come from the recipient. So I just want to take a look at Jane's question. Do expansion grants have their own grant agreements separate from the grant that was expanded? No, so expansion grants, when HUD funds an expansion grant, that's going to result in one grant agreement. So they're going to take that existing grant agreement and they're going to, whatever additional funding was awarded, they're going to add it to that existing grant, and you're going to get one grant agreement that will be for that new grant. So again, when we look at spending rates, we look at the most recently completed grant term. So if you've been recently funded an expansion grant and maybe you're still kind of in the midst of the first grant term with that expansion, if you're kind of still in the midst of it, really for any grant term, if you're in the midst of the grant term, we're not looking at the spending for that one. We're looking at the spending for a grant term that was completed. Again, Appendix A gives more details on which grant terms we're looking at. For many, for most of the projects, we're looking at grants that ended, at some point in 2022, so almost a year ago at this point. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, just to be mindful of time, to go into a little bit on the actual application form itself. So what I'm going over here, it's available in a Word format on HAND's website for you to download, complete, and send in. I want to highlight that I restructured some things a little bit this year in the application form to hopefully make it a little bit easier for all of us. So the way the application form is structured, there's one overall, what I'm calling organizational application that you're going to complete and submit once. This particularly is relevant for agencies that have multiple project applications. So this organizational application is, you'll see when we get to the attachments, it's attachments. I only need one copy of these attachments. It's going to be like your agency audit, your monitoring reports. I just need one of them. And then there's some questions that need to be completed that are really organizationally relevant, such as how do you incorporate persons with lived experience within your agency's programming. So there's one overall organizational application, and then there's going to be separate project applications. If you have multiple project applications that have to be submitted, you're going to submit a separate project application for each of those. So for the overall organizational application, you see this is the checklist. So please refer to this checklist closely. If something does not apply, please be sure to select the not applicable column. That's the only way that I'm going to know that something is not applicable versus you just forgot to submit it. So if it doesn't apply, please select not applicable. This again is where we're going to be asking for your agency's audit. There's a question that relates to your agency's grievance policy. And so we do ask for a copy of that policy. This is where you're going to include any monitoring reports that you may have, again, from the city or from HUD, documentation of participation of a person with lived experience. Again, this is, again, part of that organizational question. This first part of the form, pretty basic, your contact information. And then I do ask that you simply list the project applications that are submitted. You just kind of list them out any way that makes sense. That's just helpful so that we know kind of what to expect. I already do kind of know what to expect that you'll be submitting, but this is also hopefully helpful for you too, to make sure that you get each of your project applications in. Again, some of you might only have one, some agencies you're going to have multiple. Starting on page 29, then there's a series of questions. These are pretty simple, hopefully, that again, you're going to answer as it relates to your entire organization, versus asking if you have any city monitoring reports, if you have any HUD monitoring reports. If you don't have any reports that fall within that time frame, you just select NA. So we know that. Question around client participation. This again is the same question that we've asked for in prior years, so hopefully that is familiar. Just made that note here regarding, again, if you do submit that board roster, please make it clear kind of who is that person with lived experience on the roster. This organizational question number 4 is a narrative response. It is a scored response, asking how you meaningfully incorporate the participation of persons with lived experience. So this is a scored component as well. Again, only needs to be answered once for your agency. Questions 5 and 6, these are informational only questions, but we are again looking for a response, again, as it relates to you as an organization. Question 6 is really just about PSH match returns. So not a PSH provider, you don't need to worry about that question. And then question 7 is an optional question if there's any additional information you want to give as it relates to how you handle continuous quality improvement within your agency. So then starting on page 32, we move into the individual project application. So this is where you're going to submit one of these project applications for each application that you're submitting. So for the, again, this cover sheet, please just be mindful of the numbering, it picks up at number 12, just to kind of keep the numbering sequential for all the attachments. That's kind of helpful for me with organizing these materials. For each of your project applications, you have to submit an APR, a calendar year APR from HMIS. This is a key piece of what you have to submit. You're going to run the APR again for the calendar year, January 1st, 2022 to December 31st of 2022. Do not run it for your project term. It has to be for the calendar year. We're going to be pulling data from that APR for this evaluation. So be sure to run it for that calendar year, and that must be included. There's a couple of these attachments on significant change may or may not apply if you had any significant changes to your project. And then lastly, each project application does need to have its own signature page. So may feel like I'm asking you to sign multiple signature pages for each project, because I am. So please be sure to submit that signature page for each of your project applications. So the information in the project applications, again, we really try to make these as simple as possible because much of what we are evaluating your project on is coming from the data. So hopefully as you go through this, this won't seem too laborious. Really information on if you've had any significant changes over the past year, yes or no, then you need to submit some documentation on that. Excuse me, as it relates to financial performance, you're going to be asked to refer to the appendix that's provided that gives how much of your grant was expended. If you're below these certain percentages, we just ask for an explanation on kind of why that occurred and steps that you may be taking in the future to prevent that from happening again. There's informational only questions as it relates to eviction and program terminations. Again, this is to help us really kind of understand what's happening on the ground within your agency and then within the program. Informational only questions around client and case manager ratio. Then question 6, and I really tried to make it clear on kind of which questions apply to which project types. Question 6, this is that narrative response that's going to apply only to DV funded projects. So again, really only going to apply to right now 2 of our projects. This is where we're asking for that narrative response on strategies that have been used to improve the safety of the people that are being served by that project. So that narrative needs to be completed there. This doesn't apply to you, you can skip it, you can leave it blank, you can type NA if it doesn't apply to you, kind of whichever you prefer. Questions 7 and 8 apply only to permanent supportive housing projects. So again, respond accordingly. Skip it, leave it blank if it doesn't apply to you. And then questions 9 through 12 apply just to CAM implementing partners, so CHS only. Those questions are going to apply to. So again, you can skip them or leave them blank if they don't apply. Lastly is the signature page. Oops. This is again needs to be completed and signed for each of your project applications. So you're expected to review it and sign it and submit that signature page. The last piece with these application materials are these appendices, Appendix A through D. These are referenced throughout the materials. These are just, again, this is really part of our attempt to really be transparent with our providers on what information we're looking at when we evaluate your projects, so that you know what we're looking at, and so you can be aware of that. So please refer to those appendices as needed. I'm going to pause as well to take a look at the question. So question for monitoring, do we want monitoring docs if it was for a different program type? So for the monitoring reports, really what we're looking at, one is for if HUD monitored your CoC funded project. That's kind of the first piece. And then the second would be any city monitoring reports for city homelessness programming. So that would be like the ESG or CDBG funded homeless program from the city. Those are really the only 2 funders that we're looking at. So, if you've been monitored, say you have Department of Health and Human Services or some other, program, those we're not asking for at this point. Then Linda's question is funding for recovery housing eligible for new funding. So you haven't laid out what the new project RFPs are going to look like at this point. So I don't have an answer for that one, Linda. Sorry, TBD. Once we release those new project applications. And then the question about the APR. Okay, that's a great question, Donald. Thank you. So for the APR, we do want that submitted as a PDF attachment. I don't know if I specified that in the materials, but yeah, so let me switch back to my presentation as well. So when you run that APR, as you run your APR in HMIS, you have the opportunity to oh, I do have it. Okay, I have it here. You have the opportunity to download it as a CSV file or, as a PDF. Obviously, you're going to be submitting this to us as an attachment. And so I'm going to need to be able to see the different questions in the APR and pull the data to do these calculations. So I really need it as a PDF. One thing to be mindful of, sometimes when you download things or you kind of do the print to PDF function, make sure no columns are cut off. What I have found is sometimes you need to switch to landscape mode to make sure that all of the columns are visible. I just ask that you just take some care before you submit stuff to us to make sure nothing is being cut off, that I can kind of see everything that's in that APR. But again, the APR needs to be submitted for that calendar year. In Appendix B, we give the list of your projects, their HMIS ID number, make sure you're running it for the correct project and for the correct time frame. In terms of some other data that is going to be reviewed for this review process, all other data, the HMIS system administrators are going to be generating kind of at our level. So there are certain reports that we're going to start running now. Again, we're going to be looking at data that is from 2022. So in many ways, it's over a year old by now. And given kind of our expectations of your agency kind of staying up on your data entry and your data quality, the data that we pull now from 2022 should be accurate because it was entered and completed last year. So there may be some of these data reports that we're going to start running now, even before June 12th, to kind of, give us a sort of a heads up on some of this review work. I think I've highlighted this enough, this documentation of the board roster. Again, the monitoring reports, I've touched on this. Really, we're just looking at that March 2022 to March of 2023 range for CoC monitoring reports from HUD or city homelessness programming. Let me put the link in the chat, but all of these materials are, again, on HAND's website. The link is in the chat. I can drop it in the chat again, just so you have it readily available. Everything that I have gone over today is here under renewal project applications. These slides and this recording will be posted there within probably by early next week. The application form itself in a Word format that you can fill out is available here. I have also just recently posted these self-scoring tools. So you see there's a different tool for each project type. These documents go into much more detail on all of these evaluation criteria. They really go into detail on which question in the APR are we pulling the data from? How are we doing the math to calculate the percentages and kind of what this is the scoring range. So we provide these self-scoring tools. They're optional. You can completely ignore them if you want, or you can dive into them as much as you want. These don't have to be submitted with your application, but they're a way for you to get a sense of how your project may be performing. And again, it's a way that we really try to be transparent with our providers so that you know how we're doing the math, essentially, when we come up with these percentages that you're scored on. So you can check out those self-scoring tools. They're pretty detailed, they're pretty long. So if it interests you, you can dive in. If it doesn't interest you, you don't need to review them. Again, materials are due to me by noon on the 12th. Everything should be emailed to me. At some point, I think we have hopes of coming up with a different way of you submitting materials electronically. We're still in the email world. So please email them to me. If you need to send multiple emails, that's fine. If you need to put things in a zip file, that's fine. Just please email them to me, and then you will receive a email confirmation from me once I receive those. So, all right, I will pause for any additional questions that folks may have. You have my contact information there. You can feel free to reach out to me as you are diving into the applications. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me with questions, just to make sure what is it you need to submit if you're kind of approaching this correctly. For this type of process, I want to be sure to be able to answer those questions. So don't hesitate to reach out. If you're asking something that I can't answer, I'll let you know that, but I would rather have you ask the question than not ask. All right. Just pause for another moment if there's any other questions. Not seeing any. Thank you all for your time this morning. I know this is a lot of information. Yeah, don't hesitate to reach out for anything else. And yeah, have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.